Welcome to Wise Heads, where experienced specialists share practical thinking to help you build a better business and make better decisions. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Strategy Director Ryan Sproull. Ryan has spent years helping a wide range of businesses uncover competitive advantage, make better commercial decisions, and think more strategically about where they're headed and how they're going to get there. Today, we're unpacking one of the most misunderstood words in business, strategy. We'll explore what strategy actually is, why so many businesses confuse it with simply being busy, and how making a handful of deliberate choices can completely change the trajectory of a business. Ryan, thank you for joining me this week.
Thank you, Adam. Lovely to be here.
Before we dive into strategy, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and the journey that's led you into this kind of work?
I've had, like many strategists, I've had a sort of a patchwork back and forth kind of journey. I worked in different agency roles. I worked client side a couple of times. Eventually, I think probably my biggest break was becoming a kind of 2IC in the strategy department of VML Sydney as a marketing agency. And the advantage that I had there was that the managing director had a digital first or an experiential first, or even just kind of a not anything in particular first approach to creative ideas for marketing. And that meant that we often ended up taking quite unusual approaches to client problems. And that gave me a lot of scope to do a lot of different kinds of strategy, not just, kind of brand or creative strategy, but broader experience strategy. And after working on those kinds of things for several years and building up an understanding of what's going on beneath the surface of these different kinds of strategy, I decided to kind of elevate a bit further and did my MBA.
Look, you said that word strategy, and you are a strategist by title, amongst other titles that I'm sure you've earned. What is strategy and what is a strategist?
Everyone who writes a book on strategy or teaches a course on strategy or does any kind of talk on strategy always does their kind of forget everything you think you know about strategy. Here is what it actually means. And so you hear a lot of definitions. And I think one of the reasons why there are so many definitions is because what strategy is pretty contingent on the context in which strategy is being done. So you can give a definition of what strategy is for business strategy, which is what some people are meaning when they say strategy. But if you're talking to somebody who's the head of strategy at a marketing agency, like a creative agency, what they mean by strategy is quite different from business strategy. And their definition would be quite different. Both of them would be accurate because they're describing what strategy is in the context of their domains. And then the same for, other kinds of strategy, military strategy, political strategy, all these different kinds of things. So the question is, what is common to all of these different definitions or these different domains that makes them each strategy? And often attempts to define strategy look at things like hierarchy and scale. So they tend to go, well, strategy is big picture, and strategy is long-term time frame. And that's the difference between strategy and they'll say and tactics usually or something else to describe the more short-term, more smaller scale actions that people can take. So that makes sense. I think that's a pretty good answer a lot of the time, that or at least it applies a lot of the time, but I don't think it's actually the definition of strategy. I think that those are times in which strategy or situations in which strategy tend to arise as a required craft. What do we do in the long term? What do we do at the big scale? Because we don't need to ask the question, how do we do this when it comes to the smaller things? Tactics, we know the best way to run a social media marketing campaign or something like that. We know a lot of best practices for that. We know how to do resourcing and manage schedules. We know how to manage supply chain, inbound logistics and things like that. There are best ways to do all of these things, and we can do those things. Strategy is the craft of answering the question, given this objective, what should we do when we don't know what to do and there is no answer available for us? And most of the time, that situation is large scale and longer time frame, because it's easy to know what to do on the smaller scale and the shorter time frame. We know how to get through this week. We know how to get through this month. We know how to, to do the books, and we know how to do the sales, and we know how to do all the different parts of the business. But if we take a step back, suddenly the picture is bigger, and there isn't such an easy answer to the question, what should we do? But those scale situations, and the other thing is hierarchy. People say, oh, well, strategy is what like the executive do, is what the C-suite do. Executive do strategy, and then other people kind of like carry it out. But that doesn't hold either, because you go, okay, well, here's a corporate strategy of a company that owns a lot of businesses, and there's a business strategy which is informed by the corporate strategy to some degree, and the business strategy informs the operations strategy here and the marketing strategy here and maybe an HR strategy here or something like that. And you've got the marketing strategy, which is informing a brand strategy here and, like a social media strategy here. And you've got a PR strategy over here. And each of these are strategies. They're being called strategies. They're being developed as strategy. From the perspective of the corporate strategy, the business strategy is like tactics, or it's like, well, somebody else is going to work out how to do that. They'll carry it out. The corporate strategy has decided this stuff here. And the same at the business strategy level. Well, the business has worked out what its strategy is. The marketing department will work out how to do the things that the business strategy has assigned it as priorities, and so on. So it sort of cascades down. So the idea that strategy is what more senior people do, it tends to correlate, but it's not the definition of it. The idea that strategy is what you do at a longer time frame or at a broader scale tends to correlate, but isn't the definition of it. My definition is strategy is working out what to do when you don't know what to do. And arguably, and I've just been playing around with this definition in my head recently, strategy is breaking down the question of how do we achieve this goal when we don't know how to do it, and breaking it down into things that we do know how to do.
Can I ask you, though, in the same context, what do you tell your parents or your in-laws that you do?
For a long time, when I was working in mostly in agency strategy, I would say that I translate business problems into creative challenges, which sounded very clever and tended to stop people from asking any further questions about it. I think about stuff. Oh, what do you do? What do you do, Ryan? I think about stuff. I think about business problems, and I try to come up with elegant, simple solutions to effectively achieve success, however defined.
When, in your experience, when a business owner says, we need a strategy, what problem are they usually trying to solve in their minds, at least?
I mean, usually the first question that I ask is exactly that. Well, what do you mean by strategy when you say that you need a strategy? Partly because of what I was talking about before, people have heard ideas of strategy from people who specialize in different kinds of strategy. And so it's not uncommon to talk to somebody who is in a leadership position in a business, and they say, we need a strategy. And actually what they mean is they need a brand strategy. They're aware that their marketing and their brand strategy is lacking coherence or lacking a clear kind of easily explainable identity or something like that. They may also need an actual business strategy, but it's worth asking, what they mean, because often the reasons people say that can be quite different. But I think it is because they don't have an answer to the question, what should we do, outside of the day-to-day. And they feel a sense of anxiety that the day-to-day must surely be getting in the way of something called strategy or something called business, having a plan and having a bigger plan. The day-to-day, the week-to-week keeps them so busy that they can't think about these things. In the back of their head, they know that they need something. So it's often quite a vague kind of ill-defined feeling, because they do know the answer to the question, what should you be doing like today or this week? But when you do elevate that to, okay, well, what is the plan for the next couple of years? How do you choose how to make investments, not just the day-to-day operational spends of the business, but how do you decide where your capital expenditure is going to go? What kind of capabilities are you going to build out? What kind of new markets are you going to seek, or are you going to seek any? The questions of how to make decisions that will affect tomorrow's day-to-day operations and decide what tomorrow's day-to-day operations are going to be is where they need a strategy. And often they just don't even have the language to describe what it is that they need, which can make it tricky, and is why you need to ask the question, what actually is currently upsetting you? What's keeping you awake at night?
And in those instances, do you sometimes find that most businesses kind of already have a strategy, even if it's simply evolved by accident or rather than actually being consciously chosen? Like there's already a strategy in place. That's it really. So, I mean, within the kind of the academic field, there's a lot of talk about the difference between, the distinction between like emergent strategy versus kind of intentional planned strategy. And there was for a while, and there still is, an argument that says that for whatever the planning, strategy is just kind of what a business does, and it can emerge organically from the cascading individual choices that like smaller tier workers and managers are making within the business, which ladders up to a kind of a coherent picture of how this business operates without there having been an intentional plan. I think that the reality is somewhere in between, that there's no such thing as a plan that completely survives contact with reality. But I also think that relying on evolutionary mechanics within an organization to kind of give rise to the right strategy is probably a little bit hopeful, forgetting how much of evolution involves, organisms failing terribly. So why is it so difficult to do it well and to get it right?
I think it's hard in a way that people aren't used to things being hard. It requires a combination of research and information gathering, finding out the stuff that is relevant and knowing what to look for. But even when you know what to look for, it still takes time and effort to gather the information that's going to be relevant for doing strategy. And then the doing of the strategy requires a combination of logical thinking and creative possibility imagining. And often people are better at one of those two things than the other, or are more used to thinking in one of those two ways than the other. And probably the third element to that of why it can be difficult is that, related to that creative thinking, I suppose, is that the longer that somebody has been doing something and working in a particular industry, they become very expert at that industry, but it also means they kind of internalize a lot of the assumptions, which, if questioned, could reveal a far more effective strategy than they might otherwise have been able to think of. And so there is also the difficulty, the hardness of kind of thinking outside of your usual way of seeing the world. And everybody's got a way of seeing the world. Nobody has a omniscient kind of view of everything. But it's one reason why doing strategy with other people, with your leadership team, rather than kind of sitting down and trying to nut it out by yourself, can be useful. Turn it into a dialogue where different perspectives, including maybe some perspectives that are outside of the expertise industry.
You spoke before a little bit about strategy in some ways being what a business does, right? Which could skew or lend itself towards operational excellence. What's the difference between operational excellence and strategy?
You talked about emergent strategy kind of that every business maybe already has a strategy. Any business that is not failing, any business that is successful, has some kind of underlying logic to why it's able to continue operating. And maybe it is because it is an averagely performing business in a category where other averagely performing businesses are also taking a piece of the pie of the market, and everybody's they're all doing it well enough to survive. And so there is an underlying logic there, which is that we do this, we get these inputs and we do some things, and then we sell the product or service to people who are willing to pay money for it, and they pay more for it than it cost us to make overall, and then so the business continues. So first of all, I think it's true that there is always an underlying logic as to why a business has not gone out of business. And you could, if you wanted to, call that a strategy and say that the task of doing strategy is to improve upon that in some way. Often when you talk to people who think that they do have a business strategy already, and you ask them to describe it, what they are describing is, we're going to do the things that we do better. Our strategy is to have, more efficient marketing spend. Our strategy is to cut down on operational costs without compromising on, quality. We're going to get more efficient with our administrative stuff. We're going to outsource this or that. Our strategy is to, have a more effective sales team. And our strategy is to do better at all the things that we need to do to be in business. And that makes perfect sense, because in your head you can imagine, if I did just do all of these things better, it would show up on the bottom line. If I was able to cut costs without compromising on quality or volume of sales, if I was able to get more ROI out of my marketing spend, however that's defined, then yeah, absolutely, the business would do better. And if the purpose of strategy is for the business to do better, then surely this is our strategy. The problem with that is that everybody else is also trying to do those same things better. And you end up coming back to the same question of, well, if everybody else is trying to do these same things that we're doing better as well, and our strategy, such as it is to try and do these things better, what actually gives us the right to think that we're going to outperform any of our competitors? So the question is, what gives you the right to expect better results than any competitor? Are you just going to try harder? Do you think that everybody else isn't trying harder to improve these things? So all of these things, they're going back to that point earlier on when I said that strategy is about answering the question, what do we do when there is no available answer? Or how do we achieve this when there is no available answer to that question? Operational excellence is getting better at the things where there is an answer to how should we do this. It is what is the best practice available for the logistics, for managing your warehouse, for managing payroll. The problem with best practice, though, is that if everybody is doing it, again, how can you get advantage? And that's why strategy is different from operational excellence. Strategy is doing things differently from competitors, not just better, but doing them differently in a way that results in a competitive advantage. A competitive advantage either being a cost advantage where you can do the same thing for less, deliver the same value for less, or a differentiation advantage in the classical terms of being able to deliver more value to some or all customers in a way that your competitors can't. But the crucial part there is in a way that your competitors can't. If you come up with a new way to cut costs that your competitors can copy, all you've done is come up with tomorrow's best practice, and you will have an advantage for a little while, and then it spreads when somebody who worked at your organization goes off to another organization. They say, hey, back at the old place, we did things like this and it was way better. And best practice spreads through an industry. But if you come up with something that your competitors can't copy or won't copy, then you've got a sustainable competitive advantage. And won't is as good as can't. And by that I mean, if you come up with an advantage, a way of doing things that gives you an advantage, and technically it would be possible for a competitor to copy you, but they won't, because it would compromise what seems to be their strategy, or it would require a perspective that they just don't share. You know, there are reasons that somebody may not choose to copy you that are not actually about ability. They're about the choices that they've made in their business. But the key thing there is that operational excellence is doing the same things that your competitors are doing better, usually the same things. And strategy typically involves doing things differently or doing different things from your competitors in a way that they can't copy, that brings either a cost advantage and or a value delivery advantage, or maybe a volume advantage over competitors.
Let's talk about that word value, and specifically value creation. I've seen you speak of reducing business performance to three things: value creation, value capture, and volume. Can you explain those for us?
The idea that your business creates a certain amount of value, and then it pays some kind of cost to deliver that value. And somewhere between the value that you create and the cost that you pay to create it is the price that you are expecting from your customers. And now you've got like a 3-part thermometer where the bottom part is the costs, the top part is the gap between what the customer pays and what they get, and in the middle is the difference between what the customer pays and what you paid to make it. And then, because that's not a complete enough picture, you throw in volume and you say whatever that's happening is affected by how many transactions are taking place. If you can do 1 million of them, that might be better than doing 1,000 of them. So those three things kind of come together to create a picture of what success looks like for a business. We're trying to create value by delivering something that people will pay for. We want them to pay as much as possible, as much as they will. We want to be paying as little as possible to deliver it. And that gives us the sort of gap in the middle of what we can retain from the value that's created. And the problem for us is that every time we want to increase the value that we're offering, the costs go up. And every time we want to decrease the costs, the value we're offering goes down. You know, or the volume that we can sell off to the side goes down as well. And those trade-offs and tensions are kind of the rules of the game, the structure. And when somebody comes up with a new best practice, suddenly the value can go up a little bit without the costs going up so much, or the costs can come down without the value coming down. But if it's best practice, then everybody else copies that as well, and we're back to the same place where your competitors are doing the same thing. They're offering value between price and what they offer. They're paying costs down here, and they're trying to extract as much as possible in the middle. And the fact that everybody is doing it keeps those prices at a point where everybody's making roughly the same kind of margins. And that's why strategy is about giving a greater advantage over those kinds of situations.
When businesses or business owners talk about growth, do they sometimes focus too heavily on that volume aspect and overlook perhaps just the value?
You know, a business can be very successful by making a small margin on each individual transaction, but doing a large number of transactions. And that's why that model starts to get a little bit fiddly, because one thing that we haven't considered in our nice oversimplification of you create value and you capture some of it is how much capital was invested to do that. And so the bigger picture again is, you know, return on investment and return on capital.
How should a business think about the relationship between cost, price, perceived value, and a customer's willingness to buy?
So the most obvious thing you can do there is use marketing to increase the perceived value. Let people know about the things that make you good, and speak to not just the functional, but also the emotional kind of needs and wants of the audience for that product, right? Associate it, make the promise so that people feel like, well, if this is what I'm being promised, I'm willing to pay more for it. That's fine. There are also situations in terms of that relationship where you're leaving money on the table, where actually the perceived value is high compared to other options, or the willingness to buy, the ease, is high compared to other options. And the market could actually sustain you, or maybe some parts of the market could sustain you charging more and you're leaving money on the table. They'll be happy paying more for what they're getting because of their perception of the value that they're getting. Easiest way to improve the perceived value of what you're offering is to innovate and actually offer better value. Let me be really super clear about what a strategy is. A strategy is saying, these are facts about the world. These are facts about our business, about our customers, about our competitors, about the broader environment. Given these facts, if these other things became facts, if they were true, we would have competitive advantage. We would succeed. If we were different in this way, if our market was different in this way, if our environment was different in this way, but usually if we were different in this way, we would have a competitive advantage because of these facts. That is a strategy. And then the carrying out of a strategy becomes a question of, okay, well then how do we make these things true that are not currently true? Yes, if we had this capability and this asset and this resource, and our customers want this, and our competitors can't offer this, we would have an advantage over our competitors in offering our customers value. So how do we get from here to there where we don't currently have that asset, that resource, that capability? How do we build it? And so that breaks that down into steps of, okay, well, we need to start investing in this. We need to start training like this. We need to change our processes like this. And you start moving towards a situation where that imagined future becomes true, and that competitive advantage that you didn't have, now you do have. One of the reasons why strategy is so difficult is that there are, in theory, an infinite number of possible answers to that question of like, how might we have a competitive advantage?
You said one of the more strategic or useful strategic questions is what needs to be true for us to succeed? Why is that such a powerful place for business leaders to start the process?
I think it's because it's a natural thing to do in the day-to-day operations of a business to look at what the facts are right now. That's what's shaping. What happened today? So what do we do? What happened this week? So what do we do? What do we want to happen this week? So what do we do? And so we tend to start with what are the facts right now, and then kind of how do we incrementally move in the direction of keeping costs down, continuing to sell, all the day-to-day operations of a business. We start with the way things are, and then we get kind of stuck in that. What needs to be true forces us to think outside of what's currently true. We have to think, okay, what's currently not true, but could be true? And that requires a different mindset from the one that is best suited to the everyday operations. There is no point when you're in the grind, when you're right at the coalface and you're doing, say, customer service and you've got a complaint. This is a day-to-day operational thing. You've got a customer service complaint. At that point, the facts of how things are right now are far more important than asking, what would need to be true for this person not to have had this complaint? What would need to be true for this conversation to have been over a lot more quickly? And that's one of the reasons why it is worth getting away from the day-to-day business for a couple of days, like leadership away days, kind of off-site things. I know they get parodied, but there is some like scientific sense to this of get away from the stress of managing the day-to-day in order to get your mind into a creative mode where you can ask, instead of worrying about what the facts are right now, let's ask ourselves what might be. What would need to be true for the things that the things that currently make us different from our competitors to give us an advantage? That's a great question. we're not identical to our competitors, but our differences don't seem to be giving us any kind of competitive advantage. Going back to how much value are we creating compared to competitors, how much value are we capturing compared to competitors? Our differences don't seem to be turning into an advantage. What would need to be true? Would the market need to be different? Would we need to be different? Would our competitors need to be different? Is it possible to make that true? Is the second question. Because if it's not possible, then move on. But if it were true, we would have an advantage, and it is possible to make that true. And I suppose the third question is, and would our competitors' reactions to that be unable to stop us from having an advantage? If you've got those three questions and you can say yes to all of them, then you've got a strategy.
What makes a strategic advantage genuinely difficult for competitors to copy?
Traditionally, the answer is either you've got access to some kind of resource that is scarce and others don't have access to it for some reason. Another is time. And that is that it can be copied, but it takes time to copy it. And that's where brand can be an example of a defensible strategic advantage. If it has been invested in for years and years and years, that is something that you have that competitors don't have. And it doesn't matter how much money they spend, they can't buy a brand overnight. Not with the same kind of, you can't buy history. One of Nivea's greatest advantages is the scent. They've actually got it trademarked. The scent of Nivea products has a particular kind of smell. And in Europe, it's the moisturizer. In Australia and New Zealand, it's the sunscreen. But it's what your mum put on you when you were a kid. And so as an adult, you smell it. And for some reason, it just feels like something that feels really comforting and stuff that you should have. But it's actually just the smell. And that's something that no competitor can buy. Another one is combinations of things, which is that if your competitive advantage comes from not just one change about your business, but let's say 3 changes about your business, which all work together to create some kind of cost or value creation advantage over your competitors. For a competitor to copy you, they can't just copy one of these changes. They have to copy all 3 at the same time. And that can be a lot more difficult, a lot more risky. And we come back to that won't is as good as can't. That sure, they could do these things, but it would require such a coordination of investments that they won't. And then the other thing is that not everybody can in a given market all follow the same strategy. So sometimes a competitive advantage is defensible because you got there first. You're doing that thing. And the size of the prize that you're gaining, let's say from specializing in a particular niche within a market, the size of the prize is not big enough for somebody to want to come and muscle in on your slice. You own that. You got there first. You owned it. Maybe you created or encouraged and nurtured the need or the desire in the market. But it's not big enough for other players to kind of want to invest and change what they do. They've got their own things. And sometimes that can be an advantage in itself. That's just like, you have that, we're over here, and the market itself evolves, the industry evolves into a kind of an ecosystem of players that are competing in different ways for different kinds of needs or different kinds of customers.
To that end, is a single clever idea usually enough, or does defensibility come from combining several choices, capabilities, and or trade-offs?
I mean, take the Fosbury flop, right? Actually, it's a classic example of a lot of things, right? First of all, if you're not familiar, Dick Fosbury was a high jumper, Olympic high jumper, and up until him, high jumpers tended to do a kind of a high kick kind of method for jumping over the bar, and then he did the flop where he ran up and then sort of just got his whole body just over it, and that allowed him to go higher because he didn't need to lift his body as high as the other technique required. So he came and he did very, very well and kicked a whole bunch of asses. 4 years later, he got like 7th or 8th, maybe 15th. I can't remember what it is. And that's because everybody else just started doing the same thing. Everybody else started using the same technique. They all practiced with it. And some of them just had better athleticism than him. He came in with the best method at the time, but then that became best practice and everybody else started doing it. And then he actually wasn't as good at it as it turns out other people were. The only other thing I would say about that story is that technology enabled it. Up until that point, it wasn't that people hadn't thought of flopping themselves over the way that he did it. It's that the matting was not deep enough to protect a person from when they land that way. And so technology actually made it possible. And he was the first person at an Olympic competitive level to kind of make this connection that, actually, the reason why we couldn't do this before no longer exists. Technology has moved on. Great strategic opportunity. Cool. But he got his success for that one Olympics. And then after that, everybody else copied him, and his advantage was not defensible. He wasn't able to maintain it. So a great idea that's copyable becomes tomorrow's best practice. A great idea that can't be copied for one reason or another. And, like patents is intellectual property. Patents are one way of doing this. There are such things as first mover advantages. If you're the first to market with a new idea, your brand can be so associated with that new idea that you have an advantage against newcomers later on if you took enough advantage of being the first mover. So I don't think there's any real simple answer to the question of is a single idea, if it's good enough, is it good enough to give it an advantage? It comes down to how copyable it is and how translatable it is into, does it reduce costs? Does it increase value or perceived value? Does it help increase the volume at which sales are being made?
We sometimes talk about strategy as beating our competitors. Is that framing a little bit too narrow in your view?
We tend to use like military language when we're describing what we're doing in business. We've got target customers, we're up against competition. It describes it as a zero-sum game. Even a lot of the things that I've talked about describe things as a little bit of a zero-sum game where I'm like, okay, well, there's this many customers out here and they've got this much money to spend and we're creating value and we're capturing some of the value from them and our competitors are trying to do the same. And it feels a little bit like if our slice of the pie gets bigger, theirs gets smaller and vice versa. There are situations where, for example, a category leader might work to increase the size of the category overall to the advantage of everyone. If you look at, say, Comvita is a very, very large player in the world of Manuka honey. There's lots of little Manuka honey players. If Comvita goes out there and promotes Manuka honey as a medicinal or digestive or just a taste kind of product, and more people become interested in it as a category of thing, Comvita benefits the most if they're the biggest player. They benefit the most from that increased size, but all of the other players also are advantaged by that. And that's why you do get like industry bodies that are, competitors work together to advance the interests of the entire industry. Dairy, a bunch of competing dairy brands might get together and be like, hey, we need to stop oat milk from being called milk and almond milk from being called milk. They're not milk and they should stop using our word. And let's set aside our differences for a little while, team, and take on this plant-based nightmare that's coming for us. That's a time where you can have cooperation, and that's a strategic kind of move. But there's also, if you think about a business environment, industries, and markets as more like ecosystems, there are opportunities for collaboration and symbiosis, which are not just about taking the other people's customers. It can be about working out ways where, you specialize on this and this, I'll specialize on this. And that can be either explicit. I mean, it can't be too explicit. There are restrictions on cartels and things like that. But it can be implicit in understanding that, these kinds of customers are too small for such and such a player to go for. So these smaller companies will specialize in these smaller kinds of customers, and the big company will deal with the larger enterprise level customers. And so a market gets kind of separated out. You think about the classic I grew up with the picture of an ecosystem of like the savanna in Africa, where the tall leaves are eaten by the giraffes, and then the shorter leaves are eaten by something or other, and they're eaten by the lions, and then the lions leave the food for the hyenas to eat, and the great cycle of life continues. But that is a situation where each of those different competitors have evolved to be very good at getting their particular niche of value from the market, and they don't overlap that much. So there's lots of different ways that organizations can work with each other, either explicitly or implicitly, in ways that are of advantage to everybody. And if you open your mind to those possibilities, again, what would need to be true is not always the other guys lose and we win. There are sometimes situations where you say, well, what would need to be true for us to win and everybody else to be winning as well, and we can all win. The people that we consider competitors may be actually collaborators or cooperative in some way. So yeah, I think that it's too narrow a framing to just go, it's us versus them. But sometimes it is the right way to think about it. We're not all holding hands here. There is such a thing as competition, and we do all benefit from companies competing vigorously with each other.
If people who are seeing this are feeling and suspecting that they've been operating hard without thinking strategically enough, where should they begin?
One of the best things that you could do is try to express, and it'll take you some time, but try to express in the simplest language possible how your business makes money and what makes it different from any other business that you're competing against, in the simplest language possible. And the reason why I say the simplest language possible is because it's very easy to pave over strategic problems with lots of fancy words and numbers and graphs and charts and stuff like that. If you can get it down, if you can boil it right down to, we do this and this and this, and people like this, and so we are able to do this. Or we've got this relationship with this distributor that's a big part of why we're able to do this and this and this. Down to really simple sentences. The kind of thing that anybody in the company could understand. Oh, this is what we do. This is how we do it. And this is what makes us different from others. That at least gives you a starting point where you understand the internal logic of the business. And then you can start to ask yourself, well, with this logic, if this is how we currently make money, and this is what is different between us and our competitors, and this is what's the same between us and our competitors, that's when you can start to imagine, well, what would need to be different for this to work even better? Like this seems to be working. Could it work even better? There may be hints in what you're already doing. Hey, we're pretty good at this. What would need to be true for that to turn into a real advantage? We're pretty good. We're not that great at this. What would need to be true for that not to matter, or for us to actually be better at it, and those kinds of things? But as simple as possible, being able to say in like bullet points, we do this for these kinds of people, and this is what makes us different, and this is why people buy from us, and we're really good at this, and we're not so great at that, and we've got this, and we've got that, and you just really simple sentences. Gives you a picture of how things are working now, and that lays the foundation for how things might be.
If people remember just one thing from today's conversation, Ryan, what do you hope it is?
Strategy is about looking at the way things are now and why they are the way they are now, and then considering creatively possibilities about how things could be, and then asking the question, do we want things to be that way? Can we make things that way? And if we make things that way, can we keep them that way sustainably over the long term? If we can do those three things, we will have a successful business. But it starts with facts, and then possibilities, and then rigorous analysis of those possibilities.
Love that. Ryan, thank you so much for your time this week. I really do appreciate it. You've taken something that can often feel quite complex and made it practical, accessible, and genuinely useful. I think there's a lot here for business owners to take back into their own organizations, particularly the challenge of asking what needs to be true and what they can do to make it true. So thanks again for joining me.
No worries. Thank you, Adam. A pleasure.